Hello, and welcome to tonight's event with Olúfẹ Táíwò and the chair, Emma Dabiri, to mark the release of Elite Capture, How the Powerful Took Over the Identity Politics and Everything Else. I'll soon hand over to Emma to introduce the event properly, but it's a publisher's duty to let you know that Elite Capture is available to buy at a 20% discount. All you need to do is visit plutobooks.com, add the book to your cart, and enter the discount code Elite Capture, all one word, at the checkout. I'll put the code and a link to the book in the chat in a moment. Also, please note that this book is unavailable for customers in the US, Canada, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. If you're in these territories, please place your order with our friends at Haymarket Books instead. We also have lots of other events, book launches, and such with our authors coming up, both online and in person. Visit plutopress.com/events for an up-to-date list and for further details on how to book tickets. Finally, do put your questions for our speakers into the chat box for the Q&A section of the discussion. Now, over to Emma. Sorry, Emma, you're on mute there.
How unprofessional. I was about to introduce myself as a broadcaster and I can't even unmute the Zoom. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Emma Dabiri. I am an author, broadcaster, and academic. It is my immense pleasure to be in conversation tonight with Olúfẹ Táíwò, who is the author of what I and many others think is a landmark text. I think there's like before this text and after this text. So it's called Elite Capture, How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else. Femi is assistant professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. His work draws liberally from the Black radical tradition, anti-colonial thought, German transcendental philosophy, contemporary philosophies of language, contemporary social science, and histories of activism and activist thinkers. His public philosophy, including articles exploring intersections of climate justice and colonialism, has been featured in The New Yorker, The Nation, The Boston Review, Dissent, The Appeal, Slate, Al Jazeera, The New Republic, Eon, and Foreign Policy. So welcome, Femi.
Thanks for having me.
And congratulations on your book. I am going to start by asking you, what was your motivation for writing this book? Because early on in the text, you state your motivation. So I think that would be really helpful to share with us.
Yeah, I mean, there were a number of things that I was trying to do in this book. But one of the things was just to kind of participate publicly in this thing that I think we all have to figure out in our time, in our generation, in 2022, at the state of historical, material, political conditions as we find it. And that is sorting out this kind of double movement of the past few decades, where on the one hand, on the plane of ideology, you could say, or the kind of moral aesthetics of the time, there has been a move forward, right? In past generations, these empires didn't feel the need to even pretend like they believed in racial egalitarianism, like they believed in, equality as far as gender and sexuality goes. The list goes on, right? And so things are generally and genuinely better in some sense on that plane of things. And at the same time, we're dealing with the sociological aftermath of a global war against the left, decimation of transnational union power across much of the world, decimation of the kinds of social movements that would want to not only make inroads ideologically, but actually reshape the rest of our society in line with those kinds of moral values. And so we have to sort out which of those, we have to sort out what to do with that tension or seeming contradiction. And identity politics has been mixed up in that fight. Is identity politics, an area of itself progress or victory, or is it just yet more evidence of co-option, or the kind of cynical exploitation by elites of new ideas that maybe sound left or fit with this new kind of moral aesthetic? And so I was just trying to sort through those things.
So your use of elites is really interesting to me, and I think we should just spend like a moment with a further explanation of that. When I saw the title, I made the assumption that you were referring to elites in terms of more traditional elites. And it becomes clear very soon that you are talking about traditional elites, ruling classes, but you're also talking about the elites of marginalized groups, who might be, not elite vis-a-vis the elite who is the ruling class, but they still constitute an elite. So would you just expand a little bit on that, because I think conceptually that's really important.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for picking that out. I think there's plenty to be said about the ruling class as such, and it was important for what I was saying that isn't the target of the book, right? Or they're included in the target, but exactly as you said, using this term elite to describe more people than just the titans of industry and the most powerful political decision makers. So elite for me in this book just means relative advantage. And so until you've said what group you're comparing within, for the most part, you can't really say whether someone is an elite or not. So, the example I always use, if we're talking about Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, maybe we can just guess that whoever you're comparing them to, they're going to come out as elites, right? But the same isn't true for the vast majority of people, right? In the context of Black people in general, I'm clearly an elite by my salary and the prestigiousness of my position. I have much different living conditions than the vast majority of Black people worldwide. But I'm an assistant professor, and if you were comparing me to other tenure track professors, maybe I'm not an elite in that comparison. And so, one of the things I'm trying to get across, in particular in the case of marginalized groups, is it can still be true that the politics around a particular kind of marginalization, whether it's Black politics or whether it's gender politics, might have these kinds of problems associated with elite capture, even if the people at the top of the distribution aren't necessarily running Google or running the Pentagon.
And I also thought it was really key and important that you emphasized it can be anybody who is able to command attention in our attention economy. So included within that, a newer elite emerging through social influencers, people who that is far from a traditional elite and may even be from like a working class background, but still can command attention in a way other people from their group cannot. I really want to come back to discuss class a little bit more, but before we get into that part of the conversation, I wanted to ask you, first of all, if you could briefly define what the Black radical tradition is, because I think that distinction between the Black radical tradition and the more liberal type of identity politics and privilege politics that are so dominant online is really important for people to understand that does not represent Black thought necessarily, and it is not radical. So let's talk about the Black radical tradition.
Yeah, so the Black radical tradition, that's a term that I'm borrowing from Cedric Robinson, who wrote a really influential book, Black Marxism. And I think what Robinson was commenting on which of course many people have commented on, is just the fact that in the 5+ centuries of domination that started with the transatlantic slave trade and the construction of the planetary system of economics and politics that we have now, there's been a variety of kinds of responses of the people who ended up racialized as Black, the people who were preyed upon in the slave trade, the people who were preyed upon by other systems of racial domination built on top of and around that slave trade. And they have used everything they had at their disposal, African political history and spirituality and thought, and whatever they found in the quote unquote New World as well, to fashion a history and tradition of radical thinking. Radical for Robinson, and I would agree with this, is meant broadly, but the people who were objecting to the system itself and not to the way that the system parcels out particular advantages or particular seats in government, or they weren't objecting to just questions of who could vote or so on and so forth. There was a variety of ways of saying, no, we should radically, fundamentally alter the way that the social system works. And we have a particular, stake in that, since we are at the bottom of the hierarchies in the system. And that runs the gamut from, Black kinds of class politics to Black nationalisms and everything in between.
Thank you. I think also key, a key point of the book is your definition of identity politics as conceived of in its original inception by the Combahee River Collective. So I also think that would be really helpful to just outline, so we can contrast that articulation of identity politics with what we kind of have now.
So in the mid-70s, Black activists, Barbara Smith and Fraser, they were people who were veterans of movements that ran the gamut from liberal to radical, but movements that were running in counter to patriarchy, racism, misogynoir, you could say, right? They were in organizations like the National Black Feminist Organization, and they wanted to do something that overlapped and agreed with those organizations and those other movements in some respects, but also paid particular attention to, the nature of their oppression as queer Black women and socialists. And so they met together, they held retreats, and they wrote a manifesto, a statement that outlined their perspective. And that's the statement that is the origin, as far as I know, of this term identity politics. And what I understand them to have been saying is, look, we have the right to determine our own political priorities and agenda. The way politics should go is not us, volunteering ourselves to be foot soldiers in an analysis and in a struggle that is about other people. But we too are sources of value and insight and analysis. And so we are going to look at our situation, and we are going to decide our priorities. And what we do from there will be built on that basis. That's totally compatible with working with other people who are oppressed differently, which is in fact what they went on to do, right? And it's totally compatible with, changing and updating and refining that analysis as you learn from other people, which they also went on to do. And so it just doesn't have, nothing built into that idea has any of the kinds of drawbacks that people now, I think, insist are inherent to identity politics.
I heard one of the members of the Combahee River Collective speaking recently. It was a clip that was being shared on Twitter, although it wasn't being shared that much. It didn't seem that popular. I've looked for it subsequently and I can't find it. But she was saying, and she said it explicitly, she was just like, there's a generation of feminists who have taken kind of what we created, but they've taken the identity and they've just dropped the politics on the floor. And I was like, ooh, that's pretty damning. Like, she's come out and said it. So I think its current like articulations are very different from what they would have imagined. It's certainly not about weaponizing your identity so that you become unimpeachable, you know.
Yeah. I think, again, the thing I like to emphasize is it's a starting point, right? It's not an ending point. So just, you have to commit to politics as yourself, not as a side character in someone else's story. That's the core insight, I think.
Okay, thank you for that. I wanted to ask you now about another theme of the book, where you talk about the strategic use of identity politics as it exists today to avoid material reform. So can we talk about how identity politics actually operates in a way that is counterintuitive and actually counterproductive to apparently its stated aims?
Yeah, I think there are different versions of this on different parts of the political spectrum. But there are two problems that you see broadly anywhere left of center that I think are kind of a pair. They work together a bit. So the first half of it is the anti-coalitional half. I wish it was anti-colonial.
Yeah, cool.
So the idea that, what the difference identity politics should make, the difference that a specific analysis of the particular kind of oppression that you or people like you in the relevant senses might face, is a depiction of why you can't trust and shouldn't work with other people. Right? I think that is one impulse that people have taken to be wrapped up with identity politics. And again, the second half of this, which is closely related, is the use of identity politics as a mode of expression, as a kind of subject changer. So what the purpose is of identity politics is just articulating the particular ways that our unjust social structures fuck up your life, fuck up my life, right? In the particular ways, in the special ways that it affects me, and recognizing those and maybe even getting other people to recognize those becomes the goal of politics. And both of those, when they're working together, often work to drive you into competition with people who are, in fact, oppressed by the same things, even if differently. And because you're in competition with them, or to the extent that you're in competition with them, you're not working with them to actually change the things that are oppressing the both of you.
Absolutely, a politics of competition rather than solidarity, which completely plays into the hands of the status quo, So one of the many things that I love about this book is the fact that, why I really love like a lot of theory and how it differs to, a lot of the texts that were doing the anti-racist 2020 book lists was that are very didactic, that I was very much like writing against that tradition as well when I wrote my second book. And this idea of you're not telling people what to think. You're not saying you must kind of subscribe to this script, but you're providing the tools so that people can think critically, to help people think critically for themselves. And one of the stated aims, I think that's what you're doing. And one of the stated aims in the book is you talk about how if people can identify elite capture and when it's happening, then they'll be, far more able to contest it. And I guess it's difficult to identify because we haven't really had language around it. So one of the things that I think the book does so effectively is introduce this term elite capture, and then to make the distinction between deference politics and constructive politics. So would you expand a little bit on those ideas, elite capture, deference politics, and constructive politics, please?
Yeah, so elite capture is basically the extent to which society disproportionately responds to the people at the top of hierarchies than it does to the bottom. That is a ubiquitous feature of how societies work, at least on this side of the revolution. But I've started saying folks should think of it as more of a thermometer than an on or off switch, right? So elite capture could be more or less extensive. And the things that make it more extensive and more powerful are higher levels of equality, or inequality, I should say. So all things being equal, a more wealth unequal society will be more captured by elites. Elites will have, a bigger say in all of the aspects of social life. In a society that's more equal by wealth or by political office structures, or whatever the variables are that we use to measure this. And the second thing that plays into how much elite capture is going on is the effectiveness or existence of the sorts of institutions that exist to limit it, right? So even in a highly unequal by income and wealth society, if you have effective unions or effective regulatory bodies, you could still constrain elite capture, at least more so than a society that doesn't have effective unions, for example. So that's elite capture. Elite capture becomes a system behavior, not some kind of cynical plot in a dark, smoky room. But it's just it's the sociological outcome of these different kinds of overlapping inequalities. Then there's constructive politics and deference politics. Maybe I'll start with constructive politics.
Great.
So yeah, let's start with the good thing. I think it's directly a reaction to defining elite capture in those terms, right? If what elite capture turns out to be isn't just particular people being, unserious or cynical, but turns out to be the result of how our society is set up ecologically, then then what we should do is intervene with how our society is set up ecologically, rather than just criticizing the people who are going to do what they're going to do. We can try to challenge inequality directly, maybe by taking some of the stuff the rich have and giving it to the rest of us. That would be nice. Seems you would probably have less elite capture if that happened. Or by the other method, building up the kinds of institutions that can check and restrain elite capture. Maybe in advance of the great redistributions, maybe what you do is you build up not just the existence of unions or debtors unions or other kinds of organized social movements, but you build up their power in concrete ways. You build databases to support them. You build movement journalism to support them. You build strike funds. Those are the kinds of things that are going to constrain elite capture. And all those are a better kind of list of priorities and preoccupations than deference politics, which I think responds to this problem in more moralistic terms that I think are ultimately counterproductive. So one thing you could think, facing an unequal world that doesn't take everyone seriously or doesn't listen to everyone, is, well, when I find a person that is from a particular kind of marginalized category. I'm going to do what I can to, fix the fact that women aren't listened to by just deferring to the political counsel and analysis and direction of this woman in front of me, or this person of color in front of me, or whatever the category might be. So taking direction and leadership from individual people on the basis of their identity categories.
But I feel that's also often the demand that is made. It's the demand, I guess, by relative elites within those categories. I love when you talk about this demand to center the voices of the most marginalized, to only listen to the most marginalized. And it just so happens that I'm the most marginalized. You say, oh, it's not that they're kind of advocating to speak to the unhoused, or to speak to somebody that is in a refugee camp, or is like an undocumented worker. It just so happens to be me. And I think you making that point is incredibly important. Did you have reservations about talking about things like that? Because it can be quite because it seems counterintuitive. It seems like, oh my God, of course it makes sense to center the voices of the most marginalized. I think the point is often the people who are making the demands are not the most marginalized. What does that then in turn do to those who are the most marginalized, which is something that you talk about in the book?
Yeah, one of the things I was trying to get a handle on the book is this kind of the same thing that I do with the definition of elites, right? Who is an elite depends on who you're comparing them to.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We can also notice that who we interact with has that exact same kind of flexibility for the same reasons. So if you take as your strategy, I'm gonna defer to the most marginalized person around me, then you might need to start thinking, well, who's around you and why? Because those things aren't random, right? Those things are explained by the exact same structural forces that explain who is marginalized at all. And what I originally I wrote an article calling it "Being in the Room Privilege." It's a little tongue-in-cheek, I guess, but it's that literal, it's that concrete. I was having a lot of these kinds of conversations in seminar rooms in the Ivory Tower. Not like there's a literal admissions process that decides who can be in this room, right? And it involves being able to take on tens of thousands of dollars in debt, in a lot of cases, or score a certain number on some weird test or something, right? But there are selection criteria. There are processes that decide who gets to have certain conversations in certain places, and those processes have everything to do with the systems of marginalization, racial capitalism, patriarchy, et cetera, that we're trying to challenge in these rooms. And so hopping in at the end of all of those processes and then saying, I'm going to listen to the most marginalized person who made it here, I think really misses the boat on, the full range of things that we should be trying to deal with.
I'm just checking the time because I have so many more questions and we're at 30 minutes. So is it fine? I'm just gonna ask a couple more. Sorry, I have so many more. I'm just trying to. So I think this is really important. This deference politics, is actually more concerned, and I think this is what determines so much of the discourse, because it does kind of remain at the level of discourse of racial justice presently, this deference to others is in conversational contexts, and it's all about attention, these ideas like pass the mic, but it's not seemingly concerned with the transformation of social relations. How do we center the transformation of social relations as our kind of primary goal and objective? So I think this takes us back to your proposal of constructive politics.
Yeah, I think it does. So the hope is that, if we get into a mode of constructive politics where we take it as our top priority to, build things, organizations, literal buildings, the kinds of things that would help organizations exert power, whether it's strike funds or databases, all those sorts of things. But we take this kind of architectural construction worker view of what it is that we're doing. The hope is that that will also get us out of this kind of aesthetic, expressive conception of what we're doing, right? We're not here to have our pain heard, though that is obviously important, but we also want to change the world that's causing us pain in the first place. And so if we adapt constructive politics, one of the things I think it will hopefully be natural to ask at any point of constructing any particular thing is, how will this help? What will we do this for? Mm-hmm. What difference will it make to have a strike fund? Building that will naturally ask the question of what's good about striking, right? What difference will it make to have a database of evictions? Well, that kind of process of building will naturally involve questions of what the housing market should be like, what kinds of, whether it should even be a market, what housing should be responsive to, all those sorts of things. And so I think ultimately what I'm hoping for out of constructive politics is not just that we get these kind of individual building blocks done, but that by doing that, we kind of naturally gravitate to this culture that's asking in serious practical terms how we can make the world over again, and make it this time in a way that is built around justice rather than profit and security for a few.
Mm-hmm. I've just been told that I have I can ask you a few more questions. Cool. So I feel like I kind of asked you a question I wanted to ask right at the end because I thought I couldn't ask any more. So this might seem like a little bit, we're going backwards, but hey, what is linear time and chronology anyway? So, so one of the things, I wanted to ask you about what you write about lived experience and the kind of sacrosanct status that lived experience, is currently afforded in a lot of this discourse, and also about trauma. And I think one of the things that you say is oppression. Where is it? Oppression is not, you say it. Oppression is not a prep school. Is that one of the quotes?
Yep.
Okay. So at the moment, there is very much this narrative, not even narrative, there's this kind of organizing principle of my trauma is like my expertise, and, this kind of centralizing of pain and this sacrosanct status of lived experience. Could you expand a little bit more on how you address all of those things in the book?
Yeah, this is something I thought a lot about in both the essay that part of the book comes from, and then eventually in kind of putting the book together. And part of me wants to think about it in just kind of squarely argumentative terms. And I think those are worth paying attention to, right? So in the US, right, which is where I'm based, mass incarceration was in part put together by a political coalition that included the victims' rights movement. Right? The run up to mass incarceration was certainly ideologically premised on the idea that what the state was doing was taking the trauma of people who had been victimized during the crack era seriously. Right. So even for just straightforward political reasons, we have some reason to be skeptical that the answers that attention to trauma will give us are ones that are going to take us somewhere politically that we want to go. And we have really good evidence that that's not necessarily the case. But even setting that aside, I think the deeper thing that I thought, and the thought that I ended up emphasizing in the book is that, even if it were, setting aside, how will we use trauma, I think the idea of valorizing trauma and taking it to be kind of morally instructive in the default is just wrong about trauma. That's not what trauma is. It's not what it does to you. It's bad. That's why we try so hard to avoid it. That's why we should take so seriously how destructive it is when it happens.
Yeah.
And the idea of valorizing it, serves this broader shift to a politics of being heard and expressing yourself. But it's not clear to me that it serves anything else besides that. And so I think, that's something we need to let go of.
Because as you so strongly and eloquently argue, the point is to change things.
Yes.
As opposed to just direct kind of to command attention, for kind of for individuals in this kind of zero-sum game of like an oppression Olympics, rather than actually any concern with the transformation of social relations.
Right.
Okay, so there's some questions coming in. Before I go to them, I'm going to ask you one more. I'm just going to come back to class, which was something I had mentioned I wanted to look at in a little bit more depth at the beginning. So I think for a lot of white people, they see black people as an undifferentiated mass, and race and class are often conflated. Your race actually is assumed to speak for your class position, which completely obscures the different class positions that exist amongst people racialized as black. And I loved how you spoke about like the black bourgeoisie in the United States, also the African post-colonial elites, that Fanon so kind of presciently lampooned. And then I think within that, a more recent class of like a Black influencer, a less traditional elite. But I also loved the way you spoke about your own Nigerian, your kind of structural position as being a Nigerian immigrant in the United States, like taking pains to identify the level of inequality that exists in Nigeria, but how because of immigration policies in the United States, many Nigerian immigrants who make the grade have some sort of structural privilege, which you kind of address kind of in relation to yourself. And you talk about the way, your class advantages, and something I found very, because this is a kind of self-reflective thing that we need, but so many people are, quite keen to just to disregard and avoid. But you say some students are pipelined to prison and some students are pipelined to PhDs. And that can be just amongst Black people as well.
Yep.
So would you just speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there's so maybe the first thing I should say is, at the end of the day, what we're trying to keep track of, if we are materialists, right? And I think we are, on this call, but I think a lot of other people are as well. But if we're materialists, I think the thing we're trying to keep track of, the thing we're working towards understanding is the world is materially organized, right? And lots of organized around, the things that we do to meet our material needs, and the structures that we build around those needs. And of course, production, being the activity that we do directly in response to those needs, has a kind of pride of place, has a kind of singular importance. And so when people talk about the importance of class, they're getting something right? It's not just any old hierarchy. But I think, people take that category and that word to do, a lot of the work that we need to do by actually using it, rather than, just, insisting that that's the word that we say when we say things about injustice, right?
Like in an intersectional matrix, but then there's never any kind of analysis of class.
Right, exactly. And, one of the things that you would notice if you were looking into how classes were formed and how production was formed around them, is that it has a lot to do with race and vice versa. And all of that, we can spend hours just talking about that, but just, all I think we need for the moment is, we're not having some magically different conversation because we used one of those words and not the other, right? In either case, we're talking about this whole social thing, right? And so that's why it's important that we keep track of, the fact that Black people aren't this undifferentiated mass. Nigerian people aren't even this undifferentiated mass, right? There's these hugely important hierarchies, and we haven't even gotten to like actual Nigerian politics with all 200 languages, the big religious divide, the regional divides. We're not even getting to all of that. Just
even the
diaspora,
even the diversity amongst the Yoruba.
Yeah,
like amongst all of these imagined like pan-ethnic groups, like the diversity that exists amongst them. So yeah, there's a lot.
Absolutely. A dizzying amount of diversity, but just even just using the diaspora, homeland distinction, that's massive. It's massively different what the Nigerian American experience is on average versus what the average experience is like, what the average material conditions are, what the average income is, all those things in Nigeria. And I think that illustrates, how little these categories do on their own in the absence of a broader analysis of what difference they're making and in what contexts and what circumstances they're making that difference, so on and so forth. And so, at least one of the things I'm hoping to motivate is that, politics raises a lot of questions that these categories just won't answer and have never answered and won't answer tomorrow. And I think, whatever differences there might be between all of these analyses, that's what Fanon was saying when he was criticizing the post-colonial African middle classes. Right? As African as they are, as anti-colonial as they may have been, they nevertheless took up this kind of, privileged side of extraction rather than really taking on the struggle. And there are some structural reasons for that. Fraser was saying something similar like this with the Black bourgeoisie. And, these are questions that we have to ask about people's actual politics and commitments, and that, categories won't answer.
Thank you for that. Yeah, because if you were yourself concerned with elite capture, you could really present your identity very differently and use it in a very different way, in a way that so many people do currently. Okay, so some of the questions that are coming in. your thoughts on the importance of citing radical thought from grassroots movements versus credentialed academics and bourgeois institutions and, you know, scholarship getting it wrong?
I'm
not sure who that's from.
Let's see. That's an interesting question. I have two things. I have two things to say about this. The first thing is I think it's really important to not let the academy and credentialed academics and bourgeois institutions be the final word on what's worth investigating and what's worth thinking about. Right? Obviously, one of the things that is integral to the analysis of elite capture as I present it is like, look, elites just are just navigating simpler social situations than everybody else. So a lot of the problems just don't show up at Oxford or show up in very different forms than they might show up, you know, in a favela or something. And so, you know, I think from an intellectual perspective, there's a lot to be gained from, again, not letting the ivory tower have the final word on politics. Mm-hmm. I don't think this has much to do with citation. And I just, you know.
Citation politics?
Yeah, it's not that deep, y'all. Like nobody, this is really important to us who exist in these institutions. But outside of these places, you know, I've gone so many different places and identified myself as an academic, you know, a lot. Nobody ever asks me this, you know, nobody in prison is like, make sure that, you know, they're talking about and I'm not trying to say that nobody, down to an individual, that you could not find a person who would care about this. But I think, you know, even the people who do care about this also have other concerns and might rank those higher than academics tend to when they discuss citation politics. So, you know, there's all kinds of reasons. You should just be good to your colleagues. And so those are good enough reasons for, you know, being careful about how you cite. But we don't need to pretend that there's some, like, you know, deep dependence of the success of radical movements on what your footnotes are like. Just isn't true.
My footnotes started the revolution. So in his memoir, Indigenous climate activist Thomas Clayton Muller says he had a PhD. Oh, my accent sounded like way more Irish when I said Muller. Says he has a PhD in hustle and celebrates his avoidance of the university while educating himself. Is there value in that sort of outside self-love with regard to gaining access to something with regard to gaining access to something that, I think it should say, is sometimes fetishized as critical theory or ecology?
Yeah, I think that's cool. I think it's helpful to, you know, one of the ways that academia disciplines you into, you know, asking what I think the previous question was perceptively getting at, right? Just asking the questions that apply in your space and ignoring the kinds of questions that that the world might want answers to, including the Zapatistas and whoever else, right? One of the ways you get socialized in doing that is by, you know, living and dying based on what the academy tells you to pay attention to, like citation count, for instance. And so, you know, if you have a way of valorizing yourself and celebrating yourself in a way that isn't, you know, totally governed by the reward structure of academia, that's probably pretty helpful. I think, you know, ultimately what's going to decide whether it's helpful or not is what you do with it, right? I don't think we should kind of fetishize self-love or self-care or any of these things, right? I mean, it's good for you, and that's a good reason to take care of yourself and so on and so forth. But, you know, radical politics is about working with other people and building stuff and challenging structures and self-love is only a start to that broader set of things.
Which leads quite neatly to the next question, which you answer this in the book and in a way that I love, but this is from Anna. Does the individual and purity in identity politics undermine the cooperation needed for the collaboration necessary to achieve structural change, which often has messy stages and compromises en route?
Interesting. Yeah, I think there are two kind of extremes that we have to figure out how to steer between, right? So there's one extreme, there's one vice, there's one mistake where you go too hard for purity, and that's the kind of anti-coalitional impulse, right? Identity politics means that only the people who are oppressed in the particular way that I am are potential candidates for collaboration.
Or only people who look exactly like me.
Right. And, I think that's how you end up with small, ineffective groups. Plenty of people have said, all the things there are to say about that. But then on the other side of things, there's going too much into collaboration, right? I'm in the US, so I'll just, give a shout out to the Democratic Party, right? But it's just, if we if we change our messaging and ignore, all of the aspects of bigotry that the right has, then maybe they will compromise with us. And if you fetishize collaboration, then you can end up trying to cater to people who just are opposed to your entire project, as opposed to this or that element of your project. And I think that's also a problem.
Completely.
So, yeah, we have to figure out a space in between. I think we need to move more in the collaborative direction just based on how things have been going, but that's a contingent historical thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also like the way you talk in the book. You say coalition politics are really just politics.
Yeah.
And deference politics are inherently anti-political. Is it deference politics that you say are inherently political? Yeah.
I mean, if you use identity politics to just identify who your friends are, before you've seen people's politics, right? Before you take into account what people are actually willing to do or what kinds of changes you need to make, then I think you have built a way of responding to politics that moves you away from even changing the world as a goal, much less getting it done. And that's anti-political.
Mm-hmm. And I often think some people who've, kind of really weaponized identity politics in a particular way, they're not even particularly concerned with people who are just like them. That's just a way of mobilizing themselves,
right?
Of furthering themselves because it's appealing to a certain audience that they can, I guess, kind of manipulate in a way sometimes. Something I feel I've observed.
Yes.
So a question from Mary. How do you respond to US leftists who assume that societies like the UK or Scandinavia have less elite capture than the US, and then hold these societies up as examples of organizing goals and horizons? Is that a thing? I think of far more stronger radical organizing traditions from the United States. That's really where I would look to, but I'm not a US leftist, so I don't know.
Yeah, I'm also surprised by that, but in the age of the internet, I'm sure there's got to be somebody with this take, or plenty of people. There's got to be plenty of people with the take Mary's responding to. So yeah, I guess what I would say to them. I guess I would just try to give better examples. I think maybe you could say that the actual welfare states in Scandinavia are an example, but that's or a horizon or something, but that's a different thing it's a different thing to make that kind of comment than to comment about, the examples of how you should organize, right? When we're looking for examples of how we should organize, we should be, hopefully, I think, looking at a variety of cases and thinking, how are the conditions that those people were responding to similar and different from ours? And I don't think any country is going to be, a clear model for pale imitation for any other country. I think the most we can do is try to, identify some stuff to try to adapt in other places. And if folks want to do that from the UK and Scandinavian social movements, that's fine, but I wouldn't have any particular fixation on those places as opposed to other places.
Let me see how we are for time. Okay, a couple more minutes. I wanted to ask you how the response has been to the book, and if there has been any kind of criticism so far. Has anyone called you out?
There was a right-wing review of the book where somebody said the only things that this book has going for it is a cool title, and that he has the right demographic categories and that he looks cool. That was fun.
At least they said he looked cool. Inadvertently.
I'm calling that a W.
Also, like right-wing critiques, like whatever.
Yeah, I'm not sure what they wanted to get out of the book, or whether I should deliver that. I haven't seen much in the way of kind of direct criticism, which is interesting to me, but might be a result of how the book is written. Because, I feel like if you want to criticize me for criticizing deference politics, then you have to have a defense of deference politics. And I'm not sure if anyone has one of those.
That's what I love. The arguments are watertight. So anyone that felt attacked by it would have to kind of identify themselves as being one of the kind of actors in this space. So,
right.
Okay, so there is one question. Oh no, the questions are just flying in now. What's happening? Okay, we can go on for the 10 minutes. Woohoo! Okay, so I wonder if you could speak to your stated issues with the opportunism of the New York Times in reporting France ransoming Haiti and leading to underdevelopment. I put the ransoming in scare quotes because the writer did. Yeah.
Right. I don't have, believe it or not, I've tweeted a bunch about this. I don't actually think it matters that much. I mean, it's the most important thing is a lot of people who didn't know about the indemnity payments France extorted from Haiti now know. And I think that's, that's the important thing. Academics were mad because they felt the piece pretended as though nobody knew about the indemnity payments that France extorted from Haiti after the revolution, and lots of people did know, particularly if you do Caribbean or Black radical history. It's one of the first three things people will tell you. But I think the question there is just, it's a question of framing. I think the New York Times could have been just like more careful in saying, like, there have been studies about this and we just did a different one, but that doesn't sell quite as many copies as breaking news. And so that's a thing that's going to be annoying, especially to academics who write articles that 4 people read, but there's not much to say besides that.
I saw you tweeting something to a similar effect about that idea of breaking news, about this concept of newness. You know, everything is new, even though it's really just so many ideas are just, there's no new ideas under the sun, really. You know, so.
Yeah, there's like what, 8 billion people now, and you know, thousands of years of human history, and you know, the Indian philosophical tradition alone is literally millennia long. You know, I don't even know, you know, I'm just thinking of philosophical tradition because I'm in the philosophy department. But you know, I think in my discipline, the idea of the academic cult of new is just particularly absurd. It's fine to just say stuff. You know, there's other reasons to say stuff than like inventing a new thing to say, right? Most of the things we say every day are things people have said before. They're still worth saying, like hello. So yeah, I think that there are other targets that academia and journalism ought to have, and art in particular ought to have, other than, you know, this kind of relentless quest for novelty, which is sometimes real but often fake.
I loved when you talked about how many books exist, you know, that are very important books that like so many people still haven't read, or, you know, are just kind of like disregarded. I think this was something you tweeted. And I was just like, 100%. Okay, one more question and then we're going to finish. Where do you look to for hope besides Cabral, Fanon, and the Combahee River Collective?
Honestly, the main place I look for hope is the social movements happening now. Mm-hmm. Right? Whether it's, you know, people protecting water, or whether it's the Amazon labor union and, you know, the wave of unionizations across the US. What gives me hope are the things people are doing right now to confront their conditions, and importantly, to build the possibility of confronting those conditions even more powerfully in the future. And if we keep doing that and supporting the people who do that and bringing more people into doing that, I think a lot of the dire aspects of our contemporary political moment start to look a lot more tractable.
And better representation in Hollywood. No, I'm joking. Just before we finish, I wanted to say, I found the last page of the book actually made me well up. I felt really emotional. I just thought it was like profoundly beautiful. And I love when like theory moves me in that way. It's the same way when I first read the introduction to the Undercommons, you know, I just cried because it's so it's transformational. And I think that's what your book is. It's a transformational text. I know these terms are thrown around, but this truly is that. So I, for one, feel deeply like grateful that you've written this. I think it's so crucial and important in this moment. Oh no! Before I let you go, this is very important, and I do need to know the answer to this. Sorry, I can't believe I almost forgot this. So I think my concern, though, is this idea of elite capture. You know, the status quo is so adept at absorbing and neutralizing anything that, like, you know, kind of contests it or like poses a challenge to it. And I think about, you know, even how terms like white privilege and woke, to kind of draw from a broad range, even things like sometimes like the concept of anti-Blackness are kind of like very distorted and untethered from their original meaning. Do you think, so I think this concept of elite capture and deference politics and constructive politics is so powerful and necessary, but my fear is that within a few years, people will be using it in a way that is very different, like with identity politics, is very different to how you're conceiving of it.
I think that is inevitable, but I think it's both a challenge and an opportunity. So look, if you, at the end of the day, if you want to normalize things, you need normies, right? That's just how it works. And inevitably, ideas, strategies, ways of talking, ways of thinking will be transformed along the way. But the question for us as organizers, as would-be world makers, world builders, is whether or not we can tether actual changes to our material world and political circumstances to those changes in ideology or kind of political aesthetics, right? So the problem with identity politics, to my thinking, isn't that, the ideas changed, or even that they got less radical in terms of how people were using that term and ideas associated with it, but that came alongside a decimation of unions, a decimation of organized left ability, right? And so if we can push the ability to act on the most radical versions of any idea, even if those ideas get watered down, that's going to be compensated for by the things that we can do with actual power and with the actual architecture of our political structure. And so it's a race, essentially. It's, can we build things faster than the system waters down the analysis that inspired the building?
Yeah, that's such a great answer. Thank you.
Thanks for doing this.
No, it's a huge pleasure. So I enjoyed it thoroughly, as I did the book, and I'm recommending to all and sundry. So
take
goodbye.
care.